Number 1. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway stands as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, having confessed to murdering at least 71 women in the state of Washington between 1982 and 1998, though he later claimed the actual number could exceed 80 victims. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Ridgway grew up in a troubled household in the Seattle area where he experienced a complex and disturbing relationship with his domineering mother, who would humiliate him for wetting the bed well into his teenage years while simultaneously bathing him herself, creating a profoundly dysfunctional dynamic that many criminal psychologists believe contributed to his later violent fantasies and hatred toward women. As a child, Ridgway struggled academically, repeating his sophomore year of high school and maintaining a low IQ of 82, yet he developed enough social skills to maintain employment and marry 3 times throughout his life, presenting a facade of normalcy that allowed him to evade detection for nearly 2 decades. After graduating from Tyee High School in 1969, Ridgway served in the Navy during the Vietnam War era, stationed aboard the supply ship USS Toluga, and upon his return to Washington, he found work as a truck painter at the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, a job he would hold for over 30 years, providing him with a stable income and a veneer of respectability that masked his secret life as a killer. Ridgway's victims were primarily sex workers and runaways, vulnerable women working along Pacific Highway South near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, whom he would solicit for sex before strangling them and dumping their bodies in wooded areas along the Green River, a pattern that earned him his infamous moniker. The killing spree began in earnest in 1982 when the bodies of young women started appearing in and around the Green River in King County, creating a wave of terror throughout the Seattle metropolitan area as the body count rose at an alarming rate, with clusters of victims discovered in remote forested locations south of Seattle. Ridgway's methodology was disturbingly consistent. He would pick up women under the guise of paying for sexual services, drive them to secluded areas, engage in sex, and then strangle them to death, often returning to the dump sites to have sex with the decomposing corpses, a practice he continued until the bodies became too deteriorated, revealing the depths of his necrophilic compulsions. He deliberately chose victims from marginalized communities, calculating that their disappearances would receive less attention from law enforcement and media, a tragically accurate assessment during the 1980s when missing sex workers and runaways were often given lower investigative priority. The Green River Task Force was formed in 1984 as the magnitude of the crimes became apparent, eventually growing to include more than 50 detectives from multiple agencies who worked tirelessly to identify the killer, but Ridgway's careful selection of victims and his methodical approach to disposing of bodies in remote King County locations made the investigation extraordinarily challenging. DNA technology in the early 1980s was in its infancy, and while Ridgway was interviewed by police in 1984 and even took a polygraph test regarding the murders, which he passed, investigators lacked the forensic tools to definitively link him to the crimes despite their suspicions. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Ridgway continued killing while maintaining his job, his marriage to his third wife Judith, and his persona as a friendly, somewhat simple-minded but harmless coworker and neighbor who regularly attended church and often spoke about his religious faith. The investigation remained frustratingly stalled for years, with leads drying up and the task force shrinking as resources were diverted elsewhere. But detectives never closed the case and continued to preserve evidence with the hope that advancing forensic science might eventually provide answers. The breakthrough came in 2001 when improved DNA testing technology allowed forensic scientists to extract and analyze genetic material from semen samples collected from several victims in the 1980s, samples that had been carefully preserved despite the passage of nearly 2 decades. The DNA profile developed from these samples was run through databases and compared against evidence from suspects who had been previously investigated, and on September 10, 2001, the results came back with a match to Gary Ridgway, whose DNA had been collected during the initial investigation years earlier. King County Sheriff Dave Reichert, who had been one of the original detectives on the case and was now the elected sheriff, ordered Ridgway's immediate arrest, and on November 30, 2001, detectives took the 52-year-old truck painter into custody outside the Kenworth factory where he had worked for 3 decades, finally ending one of the longest and most frustrating serial killer investigations in American law enforcement history. During interrogation, Ridgway initially denied involvement, but as detectives presented the DNA evidence and explained that additional charges were being prepared, his facade began to crumble. The King County Prosecutor's Office, led by Norm Malling, faced a difficult decision. Washington State had the death penalty, and Ridgway clearly qualified as a capital defendant, but many of the victims had never been found, and families desperately wanted closure and the opportunity to recover their loved ones' remains for proper burial. After extensive negotiations, prosecutors offered Ridgway a plea agreement in which he would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in exchange for confessing to all of his murders and leading investigators to the remains of his victims, a deal that would spare him execution but ensure he would never again walk free. Ridgway accepted the agreement, and beginning in June 2003, he participated in what became known as the worst bus tour in history, riding with detectives through the forests and fields south of Seattle, pointing out dump sites and providing details about murders that only the killer could know, information that was verified against evidence and missing persons reports. During these confessions, which were videotaped and later used in court proceedings, Ridgway spoke with disturbing matter-of-factness about strangling women, describing his techniques for approaching victims, his preferences for certain types of targets, and his rituals for disposing of bodies, all delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that revealed the profound lack of empathy that had allowed him to kill so many people over such an extended period. He explained that he specifically targeted sex workers because he believed they would not be missed and because he harbored deep-seated rage toward women he viewed as impure, a hatred rooted in his conflicted feelings about his own sexual desires and his fundamentalist religious beliefs that condemned prostitution while he himself compulsively sought out sex workers. Ridgway confessed to returning to dump sites repeatedly to engage in necrophilia, sometimes placing the bodies in particular positions or locations that held significance only to him, and he admitted to taking jewelry and other items from his victims as trophies, some of which he gave to his son or even to his wife, a chilling detail that demonstrated the compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain his double life. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder in King County Superior Court, standing before Judge Richard Jones as the families of his victims filled the courtroom, many of them seeing their daughters, sisters, or mother's killer in person for the first time. The sentencing hearing extended over several days as family members were given the opportunity to address Ridgway directly, delivering victim impact statements that ranged from expressions of profound grief and loss to declarations of forgiveness rooted in religious faith, testimonials that revealed the devastating and permanent damage his crimes had inflicted on dozens of families and communities. Testimonials that revealed the devastating and permanent damage his crimes had inflicted on dozens of families and communities. Judge Jones imposed 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively, ensuring that even if some convictions were overturned on appeal, Ridgway would remain imprisoned for the rest of his natural life, and the judge made clear in his sentencing remarks that the defendant had forfeited any claim to mercy through the magnitude and cruelty of his crimes. In subsequent years, as additional evidence was analyzed and cold cases were reviewed, Ridgway was charged with and pleaded guilty to additional murders, bringing his official conviction total to 49 confirmed victims, though he has claimed responsibility for more than 70 killings and law enforcement believes there may be additional victims whose bodies were never found or whose cases were never connected to the Green River investigation. Gary Ridgway remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he is held in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and his notoriety, spending 23 hours per day in his cell with minimal human contact, a fate that many victims' families see as inadequate punishment for the suffering he caused, but one that at least ensures he can never harm another person. The Green River Killer case transformed law enforcement approaches to serial murder investigations, demonstrating the critical importance of preserving evidence even when cases go cold. the value of task forces that bring together resources from multiple agencies, and the revolutionary impact that DNA technology would have on solving previously unsolvable crimes, lessons that have been applied to countless investigations in the decades since Ridgway's arrest. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized women and the consequences of societal indifference to the disappearances of sex workers and runaways, prompting discussions about how law enforcement prioritizes cases and leading to reforms in how missing persons investigations are conducted when the victims come from vulnerable populations. For the families of Ridgway's victims, the resolution of the case brought a mixture of relief and anguish, providing answers about what happened to their loved ones and where their bodies could be found, while also forcing them to confront the horrific details of how these women died and the knowledge that the killer had remained free for so many years, living an ordinary life while they suffered through decades of not knowing. Number 2. Ted Bundy, the charismatic predator. Theodore Robert Bundy, one of history's most infamous serial killers, murdered at least 30 young women across 7 states during the 1970s, including several victims in Washington state where his killing spree began, though the actual number of his victims remains unknown and may be significantly higher based on his own hints and statements made before his execution. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, an unwed mother whose pregnancy brought shame to her deeply religious parents, Bundy spent his early years being raised by his grandparents in Philadelphia, led to believe that his mother was actually his sister, a deception that would not be revealed to him until his teenage years, and which some psychologists believe contributed to his later psychological development and his troubled relationship with women. His biological father's identity was never definitively established, though Eleanor claimed he was a sailor and Air Force veteran named Jack Worthington, while other family members suggested his grandfather Samuel Cowell might have been his father through incestuous assault, allegations that were never proven but which added to the dysfunction and secrecy that characterized Bundy's early family life. In 1950, Eleanor moved with young Ted to Tacoma, Washington, to live with relatives, and the following year she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook whose surname Ted would adopt, and the family eventually grew to include several more children, creating a seemingly normal middle-class household that masked Ted's emerging psychological disturbances. As a child and adolescent, Bundy was described as shy and often bullied by peers, though he was intelligent and performed well academically when he applied himself, and he developed a consuming interest in true crime magazines and detective stories, materials he later claimed awakened violent sexual fantasies that increasingly dominated his thoughts. During his teenage years, Bundy began engaging in petty theft and voyeuristic behavior, peeping into windows to watch women undress and stealing items that seemed to have no practical value to him, early manifestations of the compulsive and transgressive behaviors that would eventually escalate to sexual assault and murder. Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in 1965 before transferring to the University of Washington in Seattle, where he studied Chinese and worked various jobs while becoming involved in local politics, volunteering for Republican candidates and developing the charm and social skills that would later earn him descriptions as handsome, articulate, and trustworthy, qualities that made him particularly dangerous because they allowed him to approach and gain the confidence of his victims. In 1967, Bundy met Stephanie Brooks, a sophisticated young woman from a wealthy California family who became his first serious girlfriend, and he became obsessed with her, seeing the relationship as validating his worth and erasing his feelings of inadequacy about his illegitimate birth and lower-class background. But when Brooks ended the relationship in 1968 because she felt Bundy lacked ambition and direction, he was devastated, falling into a depression that friends and family noticed, marked a turning point in his personality. Over the following years, Bundy reinvented himself, becoming more confident and focused, earning a degree in psychology from the University of Washington in 1972 and gaining acceptance to law school, while also reconnecting with his former girlfriend Stephanie Brooks and pursuing her again, this time successfully wooing her before abruptly ending the relationship himself in 1974. a calculated act of revenge that demonstrated his capacity for long-term manipulation and his need to dominate and control women who had once rejected him. It was during this same period, beginning in 1974, that young women started disappearing from the Seattle area in a pattern that would later be connected to Bundy, beginning with the January 4, 1974, assault on Karen Sparks, a University of Washington student who was brutally beaten in her basement apartment while she slept, suffering severe injuries that left her in a coma for weeks, though she ultimately survived. An attack that police did not initially connect to the subsequent disappearances. On January 31, 1974, Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student and radio personality, disappeared from her basement bedroom in a house she shared with other students. And when police investigated, they found her bed carefully made with blood on the pillow and nightgown, evidence that someone had taken time to stage the scene after abducting or killing her, and her body would not be found until a year later when remains of multiple victims were discovered at a dump site on Taylor Mountain. Throughout the spring and summer of 1974, more young women vanished from the Seattle area and surrounding communities, all attractive college-aged women with long hair parted in the middle, fitting a specific physical type that investigators eventually recognized as Bundy's preferred victim profile, women who resembled his former girlfriend Stephanie Brooks and represented an idealized feminine beauty that he both desired and wanted to destroy. On July 14, 1974, multiple witnesses at Lake Sammamish State Park reported seeing a handsome young man with his arm in a sling approaching young women and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car, introducing himself as Ted, and two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared from the park that day after being seen talking to this man, their remains later found together at a dump site near Issaquah. The description of Ted and composite sketches released by police generated thousands of tips, including several from people who knew Ted Bundy and noticed similarities. But investigators were overwhelmed with leads, and Bundy's respectable background as a law student and former crisis hotline worker made him seem an unlikely suspect when his name did come up in the investigation. By the fall of 1974, the disappearances in Washington had stopped, but similar cases began occurring in Utah, where Bundy had moved to attend law school at the University of Utah, a pattern that investigators would later recognize as Bundy's practice of shifting his hunting grounds when he felt heat from law enforcement or when circumstances made it prudent to relocate his predatory activities. Bundy's capture came not through the homicide investigations but through a traffic stop on August 16, 1975. When a Utah Highway Patrol officer pulled over Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle after he fled from the officer's attempt to stop him for a minor violation. And a search of the vehicle revealed handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, pantyhose with eye holes cut out, and other items that the officer recognized as burglary tools, leading to Bundy's arrest on suspicion of possession of burglary tools. Subsequent investigation connected Bundy to the attempted abduction of Carol Duranch in November 1974, when he had posed as a police officer and tried to handcuff and force the young woman into his car before she escaped, and Duranch identified Bundy from a lineup, leading to his conviction for aggravated kidnapping in 1976 and a sentence of 1 to 15 years in prison. While incarcerated, Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell, who had disappeared from a ski resort in Colorado in 1975, and he was extradited to Colorado to stand trial. But during a court hearing in June 1977, Bundy, acting as his own attorney, was allowed access to the law library, where he jumped from a second-story window and escaped, remaining at large for 6 days before being recaptured. In December 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time sawing through the ceiling of his cell and making his way through the prison's crawl space and out of the building, and he remained free for more than a month, fleeing to Florida, where he would commit what would be his final murders. On January 15, 1978, less than a month after his escape, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, where in a frenzied attack lasting less than 15 minutes he bludgeoned and strangled 4 young women, killing Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and severely injuring 2 others, an explosion of violence that marked a departure from his earlier pattern of carefully selecting and isolating individual victims. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, Bundy abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, taking her from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. His youngest known victim, and a crime that demonstrated his predatory impulses had escalated beyond even his earlier patterns of violence. Bundy was arrested on February 15, 1978, after a police officer in Pensacola ran the license plates on a car Bundy was driving and discovered it was stolen, and a subsequent search revealed Bundy's identity and the outstanding warrants for his arrest, finally ending his ability to evade justice. During his trials in Florida, Bundy represented himself and demonstrated the intelligence and charm that had allowed him to evade capture for so long, cross-examining witnesses and delivering opening and closing arguments with a confidence that fascinated and disturbed observers. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, including forensic testimony that his teeth matched bite marks left on one of the Chi Omega victims, a pioneering use of forensic odontology that helped secure his conviction. On July 24, 1979, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death, and in 1980 he was convicted of the Kimberly Leach murder and received a second death sentence, ensuring that even if one conviction were overturned he would face execution. During the decade he spent on death row, Bundy granted numerous interviews to journalists, law enforcement officials, and psychologists, eventually confessing to 30 murders across 7 states, including at least 8 victims in Washington state, though he hinted that the actual number was higher and played games with investigators by providing information slowly and strategically, using his knowledge of unrevealed details as leverage to delay his execution. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, dying at age 42 after exhausting all appeals, and outside the prison hundreds of people gathered to celebrate his death, holding signs and setting off fireworks, a demonstration of the intense public hatred he had generated through his crimes and his years of legal manipulation. The Bundy case had profound impacts on law enforcement, leading to improved information sharing between jurisdictions through the development of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, greater attention to patterns in missing persons cases, and increased understanding of serial killer psychology, particularly the phenomenon of killers who use charm and respectability as camouflage for their predatory behavior. For the families of his victims in Washington and other states, Bundy's execution brought some closure but could never fully heal the wounds caused by the loss of daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cut short by his narcissistic violence, and many of the victims' bodies were never found despite Bundy's confessions, leaving families without even the opportunity to properly bury their loved ones. The case also raised troubling questions about how someone like Bundy could operate for so long across multiple jurisdictions without being stopped, how his surface respectability and education allowed him to avoid suspicion even when his name appeared in tips, and how the lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies in the 1970s created gaps that serial predators could exploit, concerns that led to significant reforms in how investigators approach cases involving missing persons and potential serial offenders. Number 3. Robert Lee Yates Jr. The Spokane Serial Killer. Robert Lee Yates Jr. terrorized Spokane, Washington during the 1990s, murdering at least 13 women and 1 man in a killing spree that targeted sex workers and vulnerable women on the city's East Sprague Avenue corridor, though he would later confess to additional murders in other locations, revealing a pattern of violence that had begun years earlier than investigators initially realized. Born on May 27, 1952, in Oak Harbor, Washington, Yates grew up in a seemingly stable middle-class family, the second of 6 children, and by all accounts had a normal childhood in various communities around Washington state as his father, who worked as a high school administrator, relocated for different positions. Yates was described by childhood friends and family as a quiet, polite young man who enjoyed outdoor activities and seemed to have no obvious behavioral problems or warning signs of future violence, a normalcy that would later make his crimes all the more shocking to those who knew him. In 1970, Yates enlisted in the United States Army, beginning a military career that would span over 2 decades and take him around the world, including service in Germany and various posts in the United States, and he received training as a helicopter pilot, eventually achieving the rank of Chief Warrant Officer for a position of significant responsibility and trust within the military hierarchy. During his military service, Yates married Linda Brewer in 1976, and the couple would go on to have 5 children, presenting the image of a devoted family man and dedicated service member who attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and maintained a spotless military record without any disciplinary issues that might have suggested his hidden violent proclivities. Yates served with distinction during his military career, including a deployment to Germany and time at Fort Rucker in Alabama, where he worked as a helicopter instructor, and he received numerous commendations and awards for his service, building a reputation as a competent, reliable officer who fulfilled his duties professionally and maintained good relationships with fellow service members and supervisors. After retiring from the Army in 1996 with an honorable discharge and full benefits, Yates and his family settled in Spokane, Washington, where he took a job with Pantrol Security, a private security company, working as a guard at the Kaiser aluminum plant, and he also did odd jobs as a helicopter pilot and worked part-time at other security positions, maintaining a stable, if modest, income that supported his family's middle-class lifestyle. Unknown to his wife, children, church community, and employers, Yates had been living a secret life for years, frequenting areas known for prostitution, soliciting sex workers, and beginning in 1996, murdering women he picked up along East Sprague Avenue, a notorious strip in Spokane where vulnerable women sold sex to survive addiction, poverty, or other desperate circumstances. Yates' victims were primarily women working as prostitutes, many of whom struggled with drug addiction and lived on the margins of society, making them vulnerable targets whose disappearances often went unreported for extended periods because they lacked stable housing or regular contact with family members who might notice their absence. His method was consistent and brutal. He would pick up women in his vehicle, drive them to secluded locations where he would shoot them, typically with a .25 caliber handgun, and then dump their bodies in rural areas around Spokane County, often near roads or in wooded areas where they would eventually be discovered by passers-by or people recreating in those areas. The first body discovered that would later be connected to Yates was that of Sean McClenahan and Lori Wason, found in September 1997 near a baseball field in Spokane. Both women shot to death and left partially clothed, and over the following months more bodies appeared, all fitting a similar pattern of sex workers shot execution style and dumped in various locations around Spokane. As the body count rose throughout 1997 and 1998, Spokane police formed a task force to investigate what was clearly a serial killer operating in their city, but the investigation was hampered by the transient nature of the victims' lives, the lack of witnesses who saw them get into vehicles on the night they disappeared, and the challenge of developing a clear timeline when women might not be reported missing for weeks or months after they were last seen. The task force collected evidence from the crime scenes, interviewed hundreds of people who worked or lived in the East Sprague corridor, and developed a profile of the killer as someone who was familiar with the area, likely local, and sufficiently organized to avoid leaving obvious evidence that would lead to his identification. DNA evidence was collected from several victims, but without a suspect to compare it to, the genetic material could only confirm that the same person had killed multiple women, a fact that investigators already knew from the consistent methodology and the ballistics evidence showing the same weapon had been used in multiple murders. Yates continued killing through 1998, and during this period he maintained his job at the Kaiser plant, attended his children's school events, participated in church activities, and gave no outward sign that he was responsible for the terror-gripping Spokane's sex worker community, a compartmentalization that demonstrated the profound disconnect between his public persona and his secret violent activities. The break in the case came in April 2000 when investigators, working through a list of white pickup truck owners who had received traffic tickets in the East Sprague area, identified Yates as someone who fit the general profile and who owned a vehicle matching witness descriptions, and when they approached him for a voluntary DNA sample, he agreed to provide one, apparently believing he had successfully cleaned the crime scenes and his vehicle of any incriminating evidence. The DNA sample provided by Yates matched genetic material collected from several victims, giving investigators probable cause to obtain search warrants for his home and vehicles, and on April 18, 2000, police arrested the 47-year-old former Army officer at his job at the Kaiser plant, shocking his coworkers, family, and community members who had known him as a friendly, normal family man. Searches of Yates' home and vehicles revealed damning evidence, including the .25 caliber pistol that ballistics would match to several of the murders, and investigators made a particularly horrifying discovery in the trunk of Yates' white Corvette, parked in the driveway of his family home where his wife and children lived. The body of one of his victims, Jennifer Joseph, who had been missing since August 1997 and whose decomposing remains had been in the vehicle while Yates drove his children around, attended church, and went about his daily life. This discovery was particularly chilling because it demonstrated that Yates had kept the body near his family for an extended period, possibly deriving some psychological satisfaction from the proximity of his secret to his domestic life, and it raised disturbing questions about how many times his children might have been near the vehicle without knowing what it contained. As investigators delved deeper into Yates' background, they discovered evidence suggesting his crimes had begun much earlier than the Spokane murders, and he eventually confessed to killing 2 women in Walla Walla, Washington in 1975, murders that had gone unsolved for 25 years, as well as a 1988 murder in Skagit County, revealing that his pattern of violence against women had spanned decades and predated his retirement from the military. Yates was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder for the Spokane killings, and prosecutors in Spokane County, led by District Attorney Steve Tucker, sought the death penalty given the aggravating circumstances of multiple murders, the vulnerability of the victims, and the calculated nature of the crimes. During the trial, which began in September 2000, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence including DNA matches, ballistics evidence, witness testimony from people who had seen Yates in the East Sprague area, and his own statements to police in which he admitted to the killings while attempting to minimize his culpability by portraying the victims as willing participants in dangerous lifestyles. The defense, led by public defenders who faced an impossible task given the strength of the evidence, attempted to argue for life imprisonment instead of the death penalty, presenting evidence of Yates' military service and portraying him as someone who had suffered psychological breaks that led to his criminal behavior. But these arguments failed to sway the jury who had heard testimony about the suffering inflicted on 13 women and their families. On October 26, 2000, after deliberating for approximately a day and a half, the jury found Robert Lee Yates Jr. guilty on all 13 counts of first-degree murder, and during the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury heard victim impact statements from family members who described the devastating loss of daughters, sisters, and mothers, women who, despite their struggles with addiction and prostitution, were loved and missed by people who had tried to help them escape the dangerous lives they were leading. On November 13, 2000, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty for Yates, and Judge Richard Schroeder formally sentenced him to death, ordering that he be transferred to Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to await execution, though the sentence would later be commuted when Washington State suspended its death penalty. In subsequent legal proceedings, Yates pleaded guilty to 2 additional murders in Spokane County in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek additional death sentences, and he was also prosecuted for the murders he committed in Walla Walla and Skagit County in the 1970s and 1980s, receiving life sentences without possibility of parole for those crimes as well. In 2018, Washington Governor Jay Inslee announced a moratorium on executions in the state, and later that year the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional under the state constitution, automatically converting Yates' death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a development that brought mixed reactions from victims' families, some of whom wanted to see him executed while others felt that life in prison was appropriate and avoided the lengthy appeals process that can delay executions for decades. Robert Lee Yates Jr. remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary, where he is held in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and the danger that other inmates might pose to a convicted serial killer, and he will spend the rest of his natural life in prison with no possibility of release. The Yates case highlighted the vulnerability of women working as prostitutes and the phenomenon that criminologists call the missing. Victims whose disappearances are not immediately investigated with the same urgency as other missing persons because of their lifestyle, addiction, or estrangement from family, a societal failure that allows predators to target marginalized women with less risk of detection. The investigation also demonstrated the value of DNA technology and systematic approaches to serial murder investigations, as the task force's methodical work through vehicle registrations and their preservation of biological evidence ultimately led to Yates' identification and conviction despite the years that had passed since some of the murders. For the Spokane community, and particularly for women working in the sex trade on East Sprague, Yates' arrest brought relief that the killer had been caught but also exposed the ongoing dangers faced by vulnerable women and the societal indifference that had allowed someone like Yates to prey on them for so long without being stopped. Conversations that continue to inform discussions about how to protect marginalized communities and how law enforcement should prioritize investigations involving victims from vulnerable populations. Number 4. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The Hillside Stranglers. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi and his older cousin Angelo Buono Jr. were responsible for a series of murders in Los Angeles during the late 1970s before Bianchi continued his killing spree alone in Washington state, ultimately murdering at least 12 young women and girls in a reign of terror that spanned 2 states and exposed the capacity for collaborative evil between 2 men who fed off each other's violent impulses and misogyny. Angelo Buono Jr. was born on October 5, 1934, in Rochester, New York, and grew up in an Italian-American family marked by dysfunction, poverty, and violence, developing early in life a pattern of abusive behavior toward women that would intensify as he aged and gained more power and control in his relationships. Buono moved to California as a young adult and established himself in Glendale, where he opened an auto upholstery shop that became his base of operations and the location where he would later imprison and torture victims. And he married multiple times, each relationship characterized by domestic violence and control that eventually drove his wives to leave him despite their fear of his violent temper. Kenneth Bianchi was born on May 22, 1951, in Rochester, New York, to an alcoholic prostitute who gave him up for adoption when he was an infant, and he was raised by adoptive parents Francis Silono Bianchi and Nicholas Bianchi, a couple who provided a stable home but could not prevent the behavioral problems that emerged early in Kenneth's childhood, including lying, petty theft, and a troubled relationship with his adoptive mother. As a child, Bianchi was described as having frequent tantrums and episodes where he would roll his eyes back and appear to black out, behaviors that his adoptive mother attributed to psychological problems, though medical examinations never identified any neurological issues that would explain these episodes, which some psychologists later suggested might have been early manipulative behaviors rather than genuine medical conditions. In 1975, Bianchi moved to Los Angeles to live with his cousin Angelo Buono, who was 17 years his senior and who would become a mentor and partner in increasingly criminal and violent activities, beginning with pimping and sexual assault before escalating to torture and murder. Buono and Bianchi initially worked together running a prostitution operation, forcing young women into sex work through intimidation and violence, but this enterprise collapsed when one of their victims escaped and reported them to police, and although charges were not pursued due to lack of evidence, the incident pushed the cousins toward even more extreme violence as they sought victims they could control more completely. In October 1977, the body of a young woman was found naked and discarded on a hillside in Los Angeles, the first victim of what would become a series of murders that terrorized the Los Angeles area for months and earned the perpetrators the media moniker the Hillside Stranglers. Though police did not initially realize they were looking for 2 killers rather than one, The victims were primarily young women and girls who were abducted off the streets of Los Angeles, often lured by the men posing as police officers with fake badges that Bianchi had obtained. And once in their control, the victims were taken to Buono's home where they were sexually assaulted, tortured, and eventually strangled to death before their bodies were carefully cleaned and posed on hillsides around the Los Angeles area. Between October 1977 and February 1978, 10 young women and girls were murdered by the cousins, ranging in age from 12 to 28, and the bodies were displayed in ways that suggested the killers wanted them to be found and wanted to send a message of power and control, positioning the corpses near roads or in locations where they would be quickly discovered by passers-by. The Los Angeles Police Department formed a task force to investigate the murders, which were clearly connected through the similar methodology, the hillside dump sites, and forensic evidence showing the victims had been strangled in similar ways. But the investigation struggled to develop solid leads despite massive public attention and pressure to solve the cases. The pattern of murders stopped abruptly in February 1978, leading some investigators to theorize that the killer had moved, been incarcerated for other crimes, or died. But without any clear suspects or breaks in the case, the investigation stalled despite the best efforts of detectives working thousands of hours to identify the Hillside Strangler. Unknown to Los Angeles investigators, Kenneth Bianchi had moved to Bellingham, Washington, in May 1978, relocating to be with his girlfriend Kelly Boyd and their infant son, and he quickly established himself in the community, taking a job with a security company and presenting himself as a law-abiding citizen who was leaving behind whatever troubles he had experienced in California. For several months, Bianchi appeared to live a normal life in Bellingham, working his security job, caring for his son, and maintaining his relationship with Kelly. But on January 11, 1979, the bodies of two young women, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder, were found in the back of a car in Bellingham, both college students who had been hired for what they thought was a legitimate house-sitting job, but which turned out to be a trap set by Bianchi. The Bellingham Police Department quickly focused on Bianchi as a suspect after witnesses reported seeing him with the victims, and investigation revealed he had been the person who hired them for the house-sitting job using a false pretense. And when detectives questioned him about his whereabouts on the night of the murders, his alibis fell apart under scrutiny. A search of Bianchi's home revealed evidence linking him to the murders. And as detectives dug deeper into his background and contacted law enforcement in Los Angeles, they discovered the connections between Bianchi and several of the Hillside Strangler victims, leading to the stunning realization that the Bellingham murders were not isolated incidents but rather the continuation of a killing pattern that had begun in California. Bianchi was arrested and charged with the Bellingham murders, and as evidence mounted against him, he attempted to avoid prosecution by feigning multiple personality disorder, claiming that an alternate personality named Steve had committed the murders while his primary personality had no knowledge or control over these actions, a defense strategy that required extensive psychological evaluation to assess its validity. Dr. Martin Orne, a leading expert on hypnosis and psychological evaluation, was brought in to examine Bianchi and quickly determined that he was faking the multiple personality disorder, using his examination to demonstrate that Bianchi was manufacturing symptoms and did not exhibit the genuine psychological markers of dissociative identity disorder, destroying the defense's strategy and leaving Bianchi with few options. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of trials in both Washington and California, where he would likely receive death sentences, Bianchi agreed to plead guilty to the Bellingham murders and to testify against his cousin Angelo Buono in exchange for prosecutors in both states agreeing not to seek the death penalty, a deal that would spare his life but require him to provide detailed information about all of the murders. In his testimony and confessions, Bianchi described in horrific detail how he and Buono had worked together to abduct, torture, rape, and murder their Los Angeles victims, providing information that only someone involved in the crimes could know and leading investigators to physical evidence that corroborated his accounts, including jewelry from victims that was found in Buono's possession. Angelo Buono was arrested and charged with 10 counts of murder in Los Angeles County, and his trial became one of the longest criminal trials in American history at that time, lasting from November 1981 to November 1983 as prosecutors presented the testimony of Kenneth Bianchi and hundreds of pieces of corroborating evidence, while the defense attempted to portray Bianchi as an unreliable witness who was lying to save himself and who might have committed the murders alone. On November 18, 1983, after lengthy deliberations, the jury found Angelo Buono guilty on 9 of the 10 murder counts, and Judge Ronald M. George, who would later become Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, sentenced Buono to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, rejecting the defense's arguments for a lesser sentence given the calculated cruelty of the crimes and the number of young lives destroyed. Kenneth Bianchi was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole in Washington state for the Bellingham murders, and he also received multiple life sentences in California for his role in the Hillside Strangler murders, ensuring that even if one jurisdiction's convictions were overturned, he would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. Angelo Buono died in prison on September 21, 2002, at age 67 while incarcerated at Calipatria State Prison in California, suffering a heart attack in his cell after spending nearly 2 decades behind bars, and his death brought some closure to victims' families, though it also meant he avoided the full measure of justice that many felt he deserved for the suffering he inflicted. Kenneth Bianchi remains incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he continues to maintain partial denials of his involvement despite his guilty pleas and his detailed testimony against his cousin, occasionally granting interviews in which he attempts to minimize his culpability or suggest that Angelo Buono was more responsible for the violence than he was, claims that investigators and prosecutors who worked the case dismiss as continued manipulation and dishonesty. The Hillside Strangler case demonstrated the dangers of collaborative killers, partnerships in which 2 individuals reinforce and escalate each other's violent impulses in ways that might not occur if either were acting alone, a phenomenon that criminologists have studied extensively in trying to understand how seemingly ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when paired with the wrong partner. The investigation also highlighted the importance of interjurisdictional cooperation, as the connection between the Bellingham murders and the Los Angeles cases might not have been made as quickly without effective communication between agencies, and the case led to improvements in how law enforcement shares information about similar crimes occurring in different locations. For the families of the victims in both California and Washington, the resolution of the cases through Bianchi's and Buono's convictions provided some measure of justice and closure, though it could never restore the daughters, sisters, and friends who had been stolen from them by 2 men whose hatred of women manifested in the most brutal and dehumanizing violence imaginable, violence that left permanent scars on the communities where it occurred and on the broader public consciousness about the nature of serial predation. Number 5. Westley Allan Dodd, the child predator. Westley Allan Dodd stands as one of the most disturbing figures in Washington state criminal history, a predatory pedophile who abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 3 young boys in Vancouver, Washington in 1989, documenting his crimes in detailed diaries that revealed the calculated and obsessive nature of his predation and his complete lack of remorse for the suffering he inflicted on his victims and their families. Born on July 3, 1961, in Richland, Washington, Dodd grew up in what appeared to be a typical middle-class family, but his childhood was marked by his parents' troubled marriage, eventual divorce, and what Dodd later described as emotional neglect that left him feeling isolated and unloved, though psychologists and investigators who later studied his case noted that many people experienced similar childhood difficulties without developing his pathological violent pedophilia. Dodd's sexual deviance began emerging at an extremely young age, and by his own admission he started exposing himself to children when he was only 13 years old, behavior that escalated over the following years to include molestation of younger children and increasingly bold acts of public indecency. Though his early offenses resulted in minimal consequences that did nothing to deter his behavior or address his dangerous sexual fixation on children. Throughout his teenage years and into early adulthood, Dodd committed numerous sex offenses against children, primarily targeting very young boys, and despite multiple arrests and convictions, he received only light sentences including probation and brief jail terms, serving no significant prison time that might have prevented his eventual escalation to murder. In 1987, Dodd enlisted in the United States Navy, but his military service was short-lived because of allegations of sexual misconduct involving the children of other service members, and he was discharged in 1988, returning to the Pacific Northwest where he took a job at a paper mill in Washougal, Washington, and moved into an apartment in Vancouver, continuing his pattern of seeking access to children through public places like parks and playgrounds. On September 4, 1989, Westley Allan Dodd committed his first known murders, stabbing to death two brothers, 11-year-old Cole Neer and 10-year-old William Neer, in David Douglas Park in Portland, Oregon, just across the Columbia River from where Dodd lived in Vancouver, Washington. The brothers had been playing in the park in the early evening when Dodd lured them into a remote area under false pretenses, attacked them with a knife, sexually assaulted them, and left them to bleed to death, an act of such horrific cruelty that it shocked even experienced homicide detectives when they responded to the scene after the bodies were discovered. Despite an extensive investigation by Portland police, Dodd was not immediately identified as a suspect, and he returned to his apartment in Washington where he made detailed diary entries describing the murders and his sexual gratification from the crimes, writing in disturbing detail about his enjoyment of the children's suffering and his desire to commit additional offenses. Less than 2 months later, on October 29, 1989, Dodd struck again, this time abducting 4-year-old Lee Yates from a playground in Portland, Oregon, and taking the child to his apartment in Vancouver where he held him captive overnight, photographing the child and sexually assaulting him repeatedly before strangling him to death the following morning, documenting each phase of his crimes in diary entries and photographs that would later provide damning evidence of his guilt. After murdering Lee Yates, Dodd disposed of the child's body in a lake near Vancouver, and he kept some of the boys' clothing as trophies, hanging them in his closet where they would eventually be discovered by police during the investigation. Physical evidence that corroborated Dodd's confessions and the testimony of witnesses who had seen him with the child. The investigation into the Neer brothers' murders and the disappearance of Lee Yates intensified as law enforcement in both Oregon and Washington coordinated their efforts, and a break came when Dodd attempted to abduct another child from a movie theater in Camas, Washington, on November 13, 1989, but this time the child's screams attracted attention and theater employees confronted Dodd, who fled but was chased down by William Graves, an off-duty police officer who happened to be at the theater. With his own family, Dodd was arrested immediately, and when police searched his apartment they discovered the horrifying evidence of his crimes. The diary entries describing in explicit detail the murders of the Neer brothers and Lee Yates, photographs of Lee Yates that Dodd had taken during the child's captivity, and items of clothing belonging to the victims, creating an overwhelming case against him that left no doubt about his guilt. During interrogation, Dodd confessed to all 3 murders and provided details about his crimes that were both disturbing and shocking in their matter-of-fact delivery, showing no remorse and instead expressing frustration that he had been caught before he could commit additional offenses, telling investigators that he had been planning to build a torture rack in his apartment to use on future victims, a revelation that demonstrated the escalating nature of his violent fantasies. Prosecutors in Clark County, Washington, where Dodd lived and where Lee Yates had been held and murdered, charged him with aggravated first-degree murder and other crimes, seeking the death penalty given the age of the victim, the aggravating circumstances of kidnapping and sexual assault, and the calculated nature of the crime. The trial began in June 1990, and prosecutors presented the diary entries, photographs, physical evidence, and Dodd's own confessions, building a case so overwhelming that Dodd's defense attorneys had no realistic option except to try to save his life during the penalty phase, arguing that he suffered from mental illness that warranted life imprisonment rather than execution. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Westley Allan Dodd guilty of aggravated first-degree murder, and during the penalty phase, despite the defense's arguments about mental illness, the jury recommended death, a sentence that Judge Robert Harris imposed on August 15, 1990, ordering that Dodd be executed for the murder of Lee Yates. In a disturbing twist, Dodd actively fought against his own appeals, waiving his right to further legal challenges and instead requesting that his execution be carried out as quickly as possible, telling courts and the media that he could not control his urges to harm children and that he would certainly reoffend if ever released, making him one of the few condemned prisoners to voluntarily seek his own execution rather than fighting to delay or overturn his sentence. On January 5, 1993, Westley Allan Dodd was executed by hanging at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, becoming the first person executed by hanging in the United States since 1965 and the first person executed in Washington State since 1963, and he went to his death showing no remorse and instead expressing satisfaction that he would no longer be able to harm children. The execution drew significant media attention because of the method used and because of Dodd's unusual decision to waive his appeals. And outside the prison, both protesters against the death penalty and supporters gathered, the latter group including some who brought signs supporting Dodd's execution and expressing satisfaction that he would no longer pose a threat. The Dodd case had profound impacts on how communities think about child safety and how the criminal justice system handles sex offenders, as the revelation that Dodd had been arrested multiple times for sex offenses against children without receiving significant prison time raised serious questions about why more aggressive intervention had not occurred before he escalated to murder. In the aftermath of the case, Washington State and other jurisdictions strengthened their laws regarding sex offenders, implementing community notification requirements that would become known as Megan's Laws in other states, creating sex offender registries, and imposing longer sentences for crimes against children, reforms intended to prevent dangerous predators like Dodd from having the opportunity to reoffend after initial convictions. The case also prompted discussions about whether the criminal justice system should be more willing to impose long-term civil commitment for sex offenders who demonstrate high risk of reoffense, a controversial policy that Washington State later implemented through the Special Commitment Center on McNeil Island, where sexually violent predators can be held indefinitely after completing their criminal sentences if they are deemed too dangerous to release. For the families of Cole Neer, William Neer, and Lee Yates, Dodd's execution brought some measure of closure and the knowledge that he would never harm another child, but it could never restore their sons or erase the knowledge of what those children suffered in their final hours, a burden that the families carry to this day as they work to remember their children for who they were rather than how they died. The Dodd case remains one of the most disturbing in Pacific Northwest history, not only because of the extreme youth of the victims and the calculated cruelty of the crimes, but also because of the extensive documentation Dodd created of his own offending, materials that provided unprecedented insight into the mindset of a predatory pedophile, while also creating profound secondary trauma for investigators, prosecutors, and jurors who had to review the diaries and photographs as part of the legal proceedings. Number 6. George Russell Jr. The East Side Killer. George Waterfield Russell Jr., known as the East Side Killer or Charmer Killer, murdered at least 3 young women in the Bellevue, Washington area during the summer of 1990, committing sexually motivated murders characterized by extreme violence and the grotesque posing of his victims' bodies in ways that demonstrated deep misogyny and a desire to shock and degrade even in death. Born on April 1, 1958, in Mercer Island, Washington, Russell grew up in a privileged environment as one of the few black families in the wealthy East Side communities across Lake Washington from Seattle, and he attended schools with predominantly white, affluent classmates, an experience that some who knew him suggested created identity conflicts and a sense of not fully belonging in either the white communities where he lived or the black communities he might have connected with elsewhere. Russell was described by high school classmates and friends as charming, good-looking, and socially adept, someone who was popular and seemed to navigate the social hierarchies of the wealthy East Side communities with ease, dating multiple women and maintaining friendships across different social groups, while showing no obvious signs of the violent misogyny that would later characterize his crimes. After high school, Russell's life trajectory became more unstable, and he struggled to maintain employment or establish a clear direction, drifting between jobs and becoming involved in petty crime including theft and burglary, though nothing in his criminal record suggested the capacity for the extreme violence he would eventually commit. By 1990, Russell was living a transient lifestyle, staying with friends or in temporary accommodations around the Bellevue and Seattle areas, and he frequented bars and nightclubs in the region, using his charm and social skills to meet women and insert himself into various social circles despite his lack of stable employment or housing. On June 23, 1990, the body of 20-year-old Marian Polreich was discovered in her home in the Rainier Valley area of Seattle, sexually assaulted and beaten to death in an attack of shocking brutality, and her body had been posed in a degrading manner that suggested the killer derived satisfaction from not only the murder itself but from the desecration of the victim after death. The investigation into Polreich's murder was complicated by limited physical evidence and few leads about who might have had access to her home, but detectives noted the unusual aspects of the crime scene, particularly the posing of the body, which suggested a killer with deep-seated rage toward women and possible psychological disorders that drove him to humiliate his victims even after they were dead. Less than 2 months later, on August 9, 1990, 27-year-old Carol Marie Betha was found murdered in her apartment in the Eastgate area of Bellevue, killed in a similarly brutal attack that included sexual assault and the posing of her body in a shocking and degrading manner, and the similarities to the Polreich murder led investigators to believe they might be dealing with a serial killer operating in the Seattle Bellevue area. The third known victim, 18-year-old Andrea Randy Levine, was found dead on September 3, 1990, in an overgrown area near the Overlake Golf Course in Bellevue, her body positioned in a grotesque tableau that demonstrated the killer's escalating confidence and his desire to create shocking crime scenes that would horrify investigators and the public, a pattern that profilers recognized as typical of sexually motivated serial killers who derive pleasure from both the murders themselves and from the impact their crimes have on the community. The Bellevue Police Department formed a task force to investigate the murders, and detectives began developing a profile of the killer as someone who was likely charming and able to gain victims' trust, probably familiar with the East Side communities where the crimes occurred, and driven by deep psychological issues related to power, control, and rage toward women. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews with people who knew the victims, frequented the same bars and clubs, or lived in the areas where the crimes occurred, slowly building a picture of social networks and identifying individuals who appeared in multiple victim circles of acquaintances. George Russell's name came up during the investigation because he had known at least one of the victims and had been seen in areas where others spent time, and when detectives interviewed him, he was cooperative and charming, seeming to genuinely want to help with the investigation, but something about his manner and his connections to multiple victims raised investigators' suspicions despite his surface friendliness. Further investigation revealed that Russell had been seen with or near the victims around the times of their deaths, and physical evidence from the crime scenes, including carpet fibers and other trace materials, were consistent with items from locations where Russell had been staying, creating a circumstantial case that was strong enough to justify his arrest. On September 19, 1990, George Russell was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, and subsequent searches of locations where he had stayed revealed additional evidence linking him to the crimes, including items that appeared to have been taken from victims' homes and forensic evidence that connected him to the crime scenes. The trial, which began in late 1991, presented the jury with extensive forensic evidence including DNA analysis that was relatively new at the time, but which provided strong scientific support for Russell's guilt, testimony from witnesses who placed him near the victims around the times of their deaths, and evidence of his financial difficulties and theft of items from victims, suggesting robbery might have been a secondary motive alongside sexual violence. Prosecutors also presented evidence of the extreme violence and the degrading posing of victims' bodies, arguing that these actions demonstrated a level of depravity that warranted the maximum punishment, and they called experts to testify about the psychological profile of the killer and how Russell fit that profile based on his background and behavior. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt by challenging the forensic evidence and suggesting that other suspects had not been adequately investigated. But the combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and the compelling circumstantial case proved overwhelming, and on November 6, 1991, the jury found George Russell Jr. guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued for the death penalty given the multiple victims, the sexual motivation, and the particularly cruel nature of the crimes, while the defense presented mitigating evidence about Russell's background and asked the jury to impose life imprisonment without possibility of parole instead of death. The jury ultimately could not unanimously agree on the death penalty, resulting in an automatic sentence of life without possibility of parole under Washington law, and Judge Patricia Aitken imposed that sentence on December 9, 1991, ensuring that Russell would never be released from prison. George Russell Jr. remains incarcerated at Clallam Bay Corrections Center in Washington State, where he continues to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and his convictions in a fair trial, occasionally filing appeals and legal challenges that have been uniformly rejected by courts. The Russell case was notable for several reasons, including the fact that he was a black man killing white women in predominantly white, affluent communities, a dynamic that raised complicated questions about race, privilege, and criminal justice that some observers felt were not adequately addressed during the investigation and trial, with some suggesting that Russell's ability to move through these communities as a charming, socially adept person may have been enhanced by his seeming to fit in despite racial differences. The case also demonstrated the growing importance of forensic science in solving serial murder cases, as the DNA evidence and fiber analysis were crucial to connecting Russell to the crimes and securing his conviction, technology that was becoming more sophisticated and accessible to law enforcement during this period. For the families of Mary and Polreich, Carol Marie Bethe and Andrea Levine, Russell's conviction brought some justice for their losses, though the knowledge of how their daughters died and the degrading ways their bodies were treated added layers of trauma beyond the simple fact of their murders, suffering that the families continue to carry decades later. The East Side Killer case also had broader impacts on the Bellevue and Seattle communities, shattering assumptions about safety in wealthy, low-crime neighborhoods and demonstrating that serial predators can operate anywhere, targeting victims opportunistically without regard to the economic status or perceived security of the communities where they hunt. Lessons that have informed how residents and law enforcement think about personal safety and crime prevention in the decades since Russell's arrest. The Russell case was notable for several reasons, including the fact that he was a black man killing white women in predominantly white, affluent communities, a dynamic that raised complicated questions about race, privilege, and criminal justice that some observers felt were not adequately addressed during the investigation and trial, with some suggesting that Russell's ability to move through these communities as a charming, socially adept person may have been enhanced by his seeming to fit in despite racial differences. The case also demonstrated the growing importance of forensic science in solving serial murder cases, as the DNA evidence and fiber analysis were crucial to connecting Russell to the crimes and securing his conviction, technology that was becoming more sophisticated and accessible to law enforcement during this period. For the families of Mary and Polreich, Carol Marie Bethe and Andrea Levine, Russell's conviction brought some justice for their losses, though the knowledge of how their daughters died and the degrading ways their bodies were treated added layers of trauma beyond the simple fact of their murders, suffering that the families continue to carry decades later. The East Side Killer case also had broader impacts on the Bellevue and Seattle communities, shattering assumptions about safety in wealthy, low-crime neighborhoods and demonstrating that serial predators can operate anywhere, targeting victims opportunistically without regard to the economic status or perceived security of the communities where they hunt. Lessons that have informed how residents and law enforcement think about personal safety and crime prevention in the decades since Russell's arrest. Number 7. Charles Campbell, the Clearview Killer. Charles Rodman Campbell committed one of the most heinous crimes in Washington state history when he murdered 3 people, including an 8-year-old girl, in a revenge attack on the family of a woman who had testified against him in a rape trial, a crime so shocking in its brutality and its violation of fundamental principles of justice that it became a flashpoint in debates about the death penalty and the protection of crime victims and witnesses. Born on September 21, 1954, Campbell grew up in Florida and later moved to Washington state, where he lived in the Clearview area of Snohomish County, working occasional jobs and developing a criminal record that included theft, burglary, and other offenses, though nothing that predicted the extreme violence he would eventually commit. On April 14, 1974, Campbell broke into the home of Renee Wicklund, a young mother living in Clearview with her 8-year-old daughter Shanna, and he violently raped Wicklund at knife point while the child was in the home, a traumatic assault that Wicklund reported to police despite the fear and shame that often prevented rape victims from coming forward during this era, when the criminal justice system's treatment of sexual assault victims was often harsh and degrading. Campbell was arrested, charged with first-degree rape, and brought to trial, where Renee Wicklund bravely testified about the assault, providing detailed testimony that led to Campbell's conviction on May 2, 1975, and his sentencing to 40 years in prison, a significant sentence that reflected the violent nature of the crime and Campbell's use of a weapon during the assault. Campbell served 7 years in prison before being released on parole in 1982, and almost immediately upon his release, he began planning his revenge against Renee Wicklund and her family, blaming them for his incarceration and fixating on punishing the woman who had dared to testify against him, a mindset that demonstrated both his complete lack of remorse for the rape and his profound sense of entitlement to victimize women without consequences. On April 14, 1982, exactly 8 years to the day after the original rape, Campbell returned to Clearview and broke into the home where Renee Wicklund now lived with her 8-year-old daughter Shanna and Wicklund's new partner, Barbara Hendrickson, arriving armed with a knife and driven by a meticulously planned desire for revenge. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. Campbell brutally raped and murdered all 3 individuals, including the 8-year-old child Shanna, in an attack of such savage cruelty that even experienced homicide detectives who responded to the scene were traumatized by what they found, a crime that demonstrated Campbell's capacity for evil and his complete absence of humanity or conscience. The murders were discovered when family members became concerned after being unable to reach the household, and when police entered the home they found the bodies of Renee Wicklund, Barbara Hendrickson, and young Shanna, all victims of sexual assault and brutal violence, with evidence suggesting that Campbell had spent hours in the home carrying out his revenge and making his victims suffer before killing them. The investigation quickly focused on Charles Campbell given the connection to the 1974 rape case and the fact that the murders occurred on the anniversary of that attack, a timing that strongly suggested revenge as the motive. And when detectives located Campbell and brought him in for questioning, physical evidence including blood and other materials linked him to the crime scene, providing the basis for murder charges. Campbell was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, and Snohomish County prosecutors immediately announced they would seek the death penalty given the multiple victims, the sexual motivation, the murder of a child, and the revenge motive that demonstrated the danger Campbell posed to anyone who might cross him or testify against him in the future. The trial in 1983 presented the jury with overwhelming evidence of Campbell's guilt, including forensic evidence that placed him at the scene, testimony about his statements to others regarding his desire for revenge against Renee Wicklund, and the compelling circumstantial evidence of the murders occurring on the anniversary of the original rape, leaving no reasonable doubt about who had committed these horrific crimes. The defense attempted to argue that Campbell suffered from mental illness that prevented him from forming the intent necessary for first-degree murder, presenting psychiatric testimony about his psychological state. But prosecutors countered that the meticulous planning and the deliberate timing of the attacks demonstrated clear premeditation and intent, arguing that Campbell knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. On June 10, 1983, the jury found Charles Campbell guilty on all 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, and during the penalty phase, The prosecution presented victim impact testimony and arguments about the aggravating factors that warranted death, including the vulnerability of the child victim and the fact that one of the murders was committed in retaliation for testimony in a criminal proceeding, an aggravating factor specifically designed to protect the integrity of the justice system and ensure that witnesses would not be deterred from testifying by fear of revenge. The jury unanimously recommended death, and Judge Philip Sheridan sentenced Campbell to death by hanging, Washington State's method of execution at the time, making clear in his sentencing remarks that the crimes were among the most heinous he had encountered in decades on the bench and that Campbell had forfeited any claim to mercy through his actions. Campbell spent the next 11 years on death row at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, filing numerous appeals that challenged various aspects of his conviction and sentence, but courts consistently upheld the verdicts and the death sentence, finding no reversible error in the trial or sentencing proceedings. On May 27, 1994, Charles Rodman Campbell was executed by hanging at the state penitentiary, becoming one of the last people executed by hanging in the United States and one of only a handful of people executed in Washington state in the modern era of capital punishment, and his execution was witnessed by family members of his victims who said they felt some measure of closure knowing that he had finally paid for his crimes. The Campbell case became a landmark in debates about victims' rights and witness protection, as the murders of Renee Wicklund and her family highlighted the vulnerability of crime victims who participate in the criminal justice system and the need for better protections against retaliation by defendants who are convicted and later released from prison. The case led to reforms in how parole boards assess risk when considering release of violent offenders, with greater attention paid to whether defendants have expressed remorse, accepted responsibility for their crimes, and demonstrated rehabilitation, rather than simply serving a portion of their sentences and being released automatically. The murders also became a rallying point for death penalty supporters who argued that some crimes are so heinous and some offenders so dangerous that execution is the only appropriate punishment, while opponents of capital punishment countered that the state should not engage in killing even in response to murders as terrible as Campbell's, a debate that continues in Washington and across the United States to this day. For the extended families of Renee Wicklund, Barbara Hendrickson, and young Shanna, Campbell's execution brought some peace but could never restore what had been taken from them or erase the trauma of knowing how their loved ones suffered, and the case remains a powerful reminder of the courage required for crime victims to come forward and participate in prosecutions and the responsibility of the justice system to protect those who do so from retaliation. The Clearview murders also had lasting impacts on how law enforcement and prosecutors think about post-conviction threats and the importance of taking seriously any indication that a defendant or convicted offender is fixated on revenge against victims, witnesses, or others involved in their prosecution, concerns that have led to better threat assessment protocols and more proactive intervention when released offenders make statements or engage in behaviors suggesting they may retaliate against those they blame for their incarceration. Number 8. Jake Bird, the Tacoma Axe Killer. Jake Bird was a transient serial killer who murdered at least 2 people in Tacoma, Washington in 1947, and who confessed to or was suspected of killing more than 40 additional people across the United States during a decades-long career as an itinerant laborer who traveled by freight train and left a trail of unsolved murders in his wake, making him one of the most prolific yet least known serial killers in American history. Born on December 14, 1901, in Louisiana, Bird was an African-American man who grew up in the segregated South during the Jim Crow era and left home as a young man to work as a manual laborer, traveling from state to state taking temporary jobs with railroad companies, construction crews, and other employers who hired transient workers, a lifestyle that provided anonymity and mobility that would later allow him to commit crimes without detection. Bird's pattern was to arrive in a new town or city, work for a period of weeks or months, and then move on, never establishing permanent roots or creating the kinds of social connections that might lead to questions about his activities or provide alibis when crimes occurred. And this rootless existence meant that when murders happened in communities where he had briefly worked, there was often no clear suspect and investigations stalled for lack of leads. The crimes that finally led to Bird's capture occurred on October 30th, 1947, in Tacoma, Washington, where 52-year-old Bertha Klutt and her 17-year-old daughter Beverly June Klutt were brutally murdered in their home with an axe, attacked in a frenzy of violence that left the crime scene covered in blood and both victims suffering massive trauma from repeated blows to their heads and bodies. Neighbors who heard screams called police, and when officers arrived they found the horrific scene and began searching the area for the perpetrator. And within a short time they encountered Jake Bird near the crime scene, his clothing covered in blood, and when he violently resisted arrest, attacking officers with a knife and injuring two of them, he was finally subdued and taken into custody. During questioning, Bird initially denied involvement in the Klutt murders, but the overwhelming physical evidence, including the blood on his clothing and his presence near the crime scene immediately after the murders, made his guilt undeniable, and prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder and assault on the police officers who arrested him. The trial in December 1947 was relatively brief given the strength of the evidence, and Bird was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death by hanging, the standard method of execution in Washington at the time, but it was during the sentencing hearing and in the months that followed that the full scope of Bird's crimes would begin to emerge. On the witness stand during his sentencing hearing, Bird made a cryptic statement that became known as the Jake Bird hex, telling the court that he was putting a hex on everyone involved in his prosecution and conviction, declaring that they would die before he did, and in a strange coincidence, several people connected to the case, including the trial judge, a defense attorney, and a police officer, did die within a short time after Bird's pronouncement, though these deaths were from natural causes or accidents and had no connection to any supernatural curse. While awaiting execution on death row at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Bird began confessing to additional murders, claiming responsibility for killings in multiple states spanning back decades. And while some of these confessions could be corroborated by evidence and unsolved case files, others could not be verified because records were incomplete, witnesses were deceased, or the crimes had occurred so long ago that investigation was impossible. Law enforcement officials from various jurisdictions visited Bird in prison to discuss unsolved murders in their areas. And in some cases Bird provided details about crimes that only the killer would know, convincing investigators that he was indeed responsible for those particular homicides, though the total number of his victims remains uncertain because Bird was not always truthful and seemed to enjoy the attention that his confessions generated. Some crime historians and researchers have estimated that Bird may have killed more than 40 people during his decades of traveling around the United States, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, though because many of his suspected crimes occurred in an era before modern forensic science and coordinated law enforcement databases, the true extent of his killing will never be fully known. Bird's methodology varied, but many of his victims were women who were attacked in their homes with axes or other blunt instruments, suggesting a pattern of burglary murders where he would break into houses to steal items and would kill any occupants who discovered him or who he decided to victimize, though some of his crimes appeared to be sexually motivated while others seemed driven primarily by robbery or simply by opportunity. The transient nature of his lifestyle and his race during an era of intense racial segregation meant that Bird was often invisible to the communities where he briefly worked, neither fully integrated into local social structures nor monitored by law enforcement who might have noticed patterns in his behavior, and this invisibility allowed him to move freely and commit crimes without generating the kind of attention or investigation that might have stopped him earlier. Jake Bird was executed by hanging at the Washington State Penitentiary on July 15, 1949, dying at age 47 after exhausting his appeals and spending less than 2 years on death row, and his execution drew relatively little public attention despite the multiple murders he had confessed to, perhaps because society at that time paid less attention to crimes against women or to the activities of transient laborers who existed on the margins of communities. The Bird case highlighted the challenges law enforcement faced in the pre-interstate highway era when serial killers could travel by freight train from state to state, committing crimes in different jurisdictions that had no effective way to share information or coordinate investigations. Problems that would later be partially addressed through the creation of national crime databases and improved interagency cooperation. The case also raised questions about how many other transient serial killers might have operated during similar time periods. Men who moved from place to place, taking advantage of the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies and the limited forensic capabilities of the era to commit crimes without being connected to patterns of violence. Offenders who have been lost to history because their crimes were never solved or linked together. For the Clutt family and the families of Bird's other confirmed victims, his execution brought some justice, though for many the knowledge of what happened to their loved ones came only after Bird's confessions on death row, meaning they had lived for years not knowing who was responsible for murders that had devastated their families and communities. The Jake Bird case remains a reminder that serial killers are not merely a modern phenomenon but have existed throughout history, and that the tools and techniques we now take for granted in criminal investigations, DNA analysis, national databases, instant communication between agencies, forensic pathology, were not available to earlier generations of law enforcement who struggled to solve crimes and identify patterns without these resources, meaning that many historical serial killers likely operated with impunity and their crimes were never attributed to them or solved. Number 9. Warren Leslie Forrest, the Vancouver serial killer. Warren Leslie Forrest murdered at least 2 young women in Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, during the 1970s, and he is suspected of additional killings that remain unsolved, representing a case where advances in DNA technology decades after the original crimes finally brought justice for victims and their families who had waited more than 40 years for answers about what happened to their loved ones. Born on August 15, 1952, Forrest grew up in the Pacific Northwest and by his teenage years had begun accumulating a criminal record for property crimes and minor offenses. Though nothing that predicted the violent predatory behavior he would later exhibit, and he lived a transient lifestyle moving between Washington and Oregon while working various manual labor jobs. On February 6, 1974, 20-year-old Krista K. Blake disappeared while hitchhiking from Vancouver, Washington to Portland, Oregon, a common practice during the 1970s when young people routinely accepted rides from strangers, not yet fully aware of the dangers posed by serial predators who used the practice to find vulnerable victims. Blake's body was found several weeks later in a wooded area near Vancouver, sexually assaulted and murdered, and the crime remained unsolved despite investigation by the Clark County Sheriff's Office, which collected what evidence was available using the limited forensic techniques of the era but could not identify a suspect. Less than 2 months later, on March 25, 1974, 17-year-old Martha Morrison disappeared from southwest Portland, Oregon, last seen in the area where she had been spending time with friends, and her body was discovered the following day in Tualatin, Oregon, showing evidence of sexual assault and homicide, another case that went unsolved despite intensive investigation by Portland police and the creation of a task force to look for connections between murders of young women in the region. The investigations into Blake's and Morrison's murders, along with other unsolved killings of young women in the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s, were complicated by the fact that multiple serial killers were operating in the region during this period, including Ted Bundy and others, creating confusion about which crimes might be connected and which were the work of different offenders. Biological evidence from the Blake and Morrison crime scenes was preserved according to the standards of the time, but DNA analysis did not exist in the 1970s, so this evidence could not be used to identify suspects, and the cases eventually went cold as years passed without new leads or witnesses coming forward with information. Warren Leslie Forrest continued living in the Pacific Northwest, and in 1977 he was convicted of second-degree attempted murder for an attack on a woman, serving prison time before being released in the early 1980s, but the connection between this conviction and the earlier murders of Blake and Morrison was not made at the time because forensic technology could not link him to those crimes. Decades passed, and the Blake and Morrison families lived without closure, not knowing who had killed their daughters or whether the person responsible had ever been held accountable. a common tragedy for families of victims from the era before modern forensic science, when many murders went unsolved and killers remained free or were imprisoned for other crimes without being connected to earlier offenses. The breakthrough came in the 2000s and 2010s as DNA technology advanced and cold case units in various jurisdictions began re-examining old evidence using new techniques, extracting genetic profiles from biological material that had been preserved for decades and comparing those profiles to databases of known offenders and to DNA collected from suspects in other cases. In 2021, forensic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that uses DNA from crime scenes to build family trees and identify potential suspects through their relatives, led investigators to warn Leslie Forrest as a suspect in the murders of Christa Blake and Martha Morrison. And when detectives obtained a DNA sample from Forrest and compared it to evidence from the 1974 crime scenes, they found a match that definitively placed him at the scenes of both murders. On May 25, 2021, nearly 48 years after the murders, Warren Leslie Forrest was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Christa Blake and Martha Morrison, a development that shocked the now elderly families of the victims who had never given up hope that someday they would learn who was responsible for these crimes but who had begun to accept that answers might never come. The arrest demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to solve decades-old cases and highlighted the importance of preserving evidence even when investigations go cold, as the biological material collected in 1974 proved crucial to identifying Forrest in 2021, evidence that might have been discarded if not for the foresight of investigators who recognized that future technology might be able to use materials that were not helpful with 1970s-era forensics. Forrest initially denied involvement in the murders despite the DNA evidence. But as the case proceeded toward trial, prosecutors in both Clark County, Washington, and Multnomah County, Oregon, prepared to present the forensic evidence along with circumstantial evidence showing that Forrest had been in the areas where the victims disappeared and was known to frequent locations where young women might be vulnerable to predators. On February 3, 2022, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and the prospect of trials in both jurisdictions, Warren Leslie Forrest, now 69 years old, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder in Clark County Superior Court, admitting responsibility for the deaths of Christa Blake and Martha Morrison and accepting a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, family members of the victims, now elderly themselves or deceased and represented by younger generations, addressed the court and Forrest, describing the decades of grief and uncertainty they had endured and expressing relief that they finally had answers and that Forrest would spend the rest of his life in prison. Judge Susan Clark imposed the life sentence, noting that while the crimes had occurred nearly 5 decades earlier, the impact on the victims' families remained fresh and the need for justice was just as important regardless of how much time had passed since the murders. Warren Leslie Forrest remains incarcerated in Washington state, where he will spend the rest of his natural life imprisoned for the murders, and investigators continue to examine whether he may be responsible for additional unsolved homicides from the 1970s and 1980s in the Pacific Northwest, a possibility given his pattern of violence and the number of unsolved murders from that era. The Forrest case became a landmark example of how forensic genealogy and advanced DNA techniques can solve cold cases that had been considered unsolvable, providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers and demonstrating that the passage of time does not erase the possibility of justice for murder victims. The successful prosecution also highlighted the importance of cold case units and the dedicated detectives and forensic scientists who continue working on old cases even when there seems to be little prospect of solving them, professionals whose persistence and willingness to apply new technologies to old evidence can finally bring killers to justice decades after their crimes. For the families of Christa Blake and Martha Morrison, Forrest's conviction provided some measure of peace and the opportunity to finally have closure on chapters of their lives that had been defined by unanswered questions and unresolved grief, though it also meant confronting anew the details of how their loved ones died and accepting that the person responsible had lived freely for many years before being held accountable. The case raised broader questions about how many other unsolved murders from the 1970s and earlier might be solvable with modern forensic techniques if evidence has been preserved and if resources are dedicated to re-examining cold cases, suggesting that there may be many more families who could receive closure if law enforcement agencies prioritize this work and if the public supports funding for cold case investigations.